I'd like to introduce Deb Fosket. She is a Medicaid fraud investigator for the Department of Justice, and she's going to be doing a presentation on Medicaid fraud. Thank you for being here, Deb.
Thanks for having me. I've revamped this quite a bit since the last presentation, so what I would ask from you, I found the evaluations to be really helpful, and if we get done a little bit early, I've taken it back from 2 hours to about 45 minutes to an hour, so just make sure on the evals that you say what you like, what you don't like, what was helpful, and what wasn't. I'm going to give a brief overview of the unit that I work in. I'm going to be going into the acronyms I'll be using, and can everybody see these? Are we on board with this? So far, so good? The acronyms I'm going to be using is the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit, DCI, the Division of Criminal Investigation, DPHHS, which is the Department of Public Health and Human Services, and they're the folks that really oversee the Medicaid funds for the state. When we talk about Medicare, because people use Medicaid and Medicare interchangeably sometimes, but Medicare is actually a federal program that provides many of the health care services, as you know, or the insurances. However, Medicaid is really overseen by each state. So Medicaid programs within each state might look a little different than they do here in Montana, and we'll talk about the services quickly that are provided here. CSRS is our sister agency. They are actually a unit of DPHHS, and they look at the billing utilization from different providers. They wouldn't necessarily look at the same things that we do, but they are, and they're not a criminal justice agency, but we have a memorandum of understanding with them so that we can talk back and forth either about cases or about the data that we're looking at. We ask for their help on a regular basis, and in some cases, referrals go back and forth between us. It's a great unit. The name doesn't really, when I look at the name, I'm going, scratch my head, and it's kind of hard to understand what they do, but they usually look at utilization of resources that the providers are billing for Medicaid for reimbursement. The next acronym, the very last one on this second slide, is a federal acronym. There's lots of federal acronyms, but the ones that interface with us, and not so much with CSRS, but with us because they are also our oversight unit to make sure that we're doing the right thing, and our auditors from the feds would come from HHS OIG. It's the Office of Inspector General. A few more, not many. CFR would be the Code of Federal Regulations. There's quite a few CFRs that govern how we're supposed to work, what our jurisdiction is, and because if you would look at the name of our unit, you would think that we have jurisdiction over an awful lot of stuff, and actually it's a fairly narrow jurisdiction. The Montana Code Annotated, those are our state laws. DME, you probably already know that one, the durable medical equipment, and that would include everything that's not a prescription medication, but would be of some help or aid to somebody who's disabled or to the elderly. It would include prosthetics, diapers, infusion therapy, that kind of thing. I'm not going to give you too much information that's technical about us, because I'll have you asleep in just a couple minutes, but just to let you know where we fit into the bigger picture. The Division of Criminal Investigation answers to the Attorney General's office, so even though we're not in the AG's office, that would be our ultimate oversight. We make use of the attorneys that are with the AG's office. We have an attorney assigned to us specifically for Medicaid fraud cases. A great guy, really brings a lot of experience to the job. We became operational about 16 years ago. At that time, not every state had a Medicaid fraud control unit. Our legislature passed the law and put us into being, and this is what makes up the unit. It's fairly small by the state standards. We only have 8 people assigned to the unit. New York has hundreds. Florida has hundreds, as you might expect. California has hundreds, shrinking a little because of the economy. So it depends on the state. I think the one that looks most like us is New Mexico. We have they may have a few more people, but our caseloads look similar, and the makeup of the unit looks similar. The only state that doesn't have a Medicaid fraud unit is North Dakota. And their cases, excuse me just a minute, their cases would be handled by their Division of Criminal Investigation for the state. And within their DCI, like our DCI, we have agents that are assigned to workers' comp fraud, to narcotics diversion, to general cases, which would be homicide cases. We have investigators tracking down sex offenders who are unregistered, etc. And North Dakota's would look similar. They just don't have a Medicaid fraud unit. Okay, we're almost done with the techno stuff. Medicaid was actually instituted in the President Johnson era on the war on poverty. And it became apparent a few years after the creation of Medicaid that there wasn't actually anybody looking at the fraud that was developing within the Medicaid program. And that's where all of this came from. New York was the very first one. Up until 1995, participation by the states in the fraud effort within Medicaid was voluntary. It is no longer voluntary. If you don't have a fraud unit, which is North Dakota, you have to ask for a waiver and explain why, and make sure that your fraud issues are still being investigated in some way. We used to laugh and say North Dakota doesn't think they have Medicaid fraud, but actually every state has a Medicaid fraud in some form. This is what we do. We investigate offenses that are committed by Medicaid providers, doctors, dentists, psychologists, wherever those providers would fit in their particular disciplines. If there's fraud going on and we get the referral, we would be obligated to start the investigation. The submission of false claims, that would include timesheets. False claims could be billing for services not provided. It could be billing for a higher level of reimbursable services than were actually provided, that kind of thing. Kickbacks are kind of hard to ferret out. Those are oftentimes worked on we call them global cases. They're often worked on a national, by a national group out of the U.S. Department of Justice in association with the Fraud Unit Association. We don't have managed care fraud per se in this state. Other states do. Other states are finding that their fraud that exists looks a little bit different than it would look like in our state when we don't have managed care per se. And where you find the fraud would be in the application process itself, rather than in what we call the pay and chase. When somebody bills inappropriately, they get reimbursed by Medicaid with Medicaid funds, and then we would go track those down. Probably one of the most important things that is part of our jurisdiction is patient abuse and neglect. Thankfully, it doesn't happen all the time. There is a certain amount in this state. We try to find it. We ask for referrals whenever possible. Most of the time, those referrals are going to go to local law enforcement first, and then if they would like some help, they call us, or we interface with them from the very beginning. And that abuse and neglect could not only include the physical abuses or the neglect or withholding of services in assisted livings or in skilled nursing facilities. It could also include the financial exploitation of those folks, either through their Medicaid waiver program, through their personal funds, that kind of thing. And global national cases. Those would be the pharmaceutical companies that are doing marketing strategies or off-label prescribing, that kind of thing. Those are way beyond our unit just taking on a case like that. That would be worked on a national level with US DOJ. Okay. We have to be separate and apart from DPHHS. We have to be neutral because of the things that we're supposed to be investigating. We have to be independent of SIRS. We have to be independent completely of DPHHS. And we can prosecute either through our own office. We can ask for local prosecution with county attorneys, but I will tell you that their caseloads are so high that we were without an attorney for about 6 months at one point, and I couldn't get anybody interested in the cases that we were shopping to them, so to speak. But because their caseloads are just so high, they've got so many other issues they're dealing with that our cases would take no priority or very low priority. So we try to do it through our own office, or we can go federal through the U.S. Attorney's Office. In our state, the Medicaid services, as you probably are very well aware, are the things on this list and on the next couple of slides. These are the basic services, and then we'll talk about what the optional services are. Those services would be, the optional services would include monies that come from the feds that are through the waiver program, that kind of a thing. But basically, we've got inpatient and outpatient, lab x-ray, long-term care, like skilled nursing facilities, periodic screening treatment for children, family planning, the rural facilities, which in our state are just absolutely vital for access for Medicaid recipients who live in those outlying areas. Those rural medical facilities are lifelines for these people. We do provide or pay for the midwife services, midwifery, kind of a silly word, but midwife services. And for the rest of the things that you see on this slide. Prescription drugs has been in the news a lot because of the diversion that's going on in this state and just about every place else in the country. When we talk about diversion of prescription drugs, and we'll talk about some trends that we're seeing in our unit, but diversion of prescription drugs is just at epidemic levels, and we're mainly talking about what's termed Schedule II drugs, which are the narcotics, Norco, the oxys, some of the fentanyl patches, that kind of thing. Huge problem. It's one of the favored programs of the Attorney General's office because it's happening at such an epidemic rate. What we've seen is in the Medicaid world is that sometimes Medicaid recipients, fortunately not everybody does this, but some folks, and you know that if you're on Medicaid, you probably don't have a whole lot of resources financially, but a lot of them are getting their prescription and then selling at least half of it. We'll talk about what the street value is for those things and what the dope cops are seeing outside in their enforcement agencies, etc. And home health. Home health is big. Home health is becoming very, very important for a couple of reasons. Theoretically, it became popular because it should be less expensive than a skilled nursing facility. That's not always true. But it also allows people to stay in their own homes, which is much more comfortable for people than having to go into a facility where there's limited space for their things. You don't take your pets with you for the most part, et cetera, et cetera. So home care is really very big and very important to the Medicaid recipients. Here's what's optional. Home health again appears on this list, and it's because of the waiver services. Nursing facility services for children under 21, and intermediate care for DD, developmentally disabled folks, cognitively impaired folks, group home, that we're talking about group homes. Dental and dentures. Medicaid doesn't have to pay for dentures. In this state, they've opted to. I think it's an important service, and they pay for that with those optional those federal funds. Rehab and physical therapy and hospice. Hospice is very, very important, and in many cases, people can again stay in their own home and receive Medicaid-funded hospice services. Transportation to appointments or ambulance services, DME again, durable medical equipment, glasses, and prosthetic devices. Prosthetic devices is a very important service. We found that there's some very interesting fraud schemes going on within prosthetics. So we would ask you if you, and we'll talk about what can you report to us in just a minute here, but if you think that there's some problem, if you are using or you have a family member who's using prosthetic devices that Medicaid pays for, and you think there's a problem somewhere, you can always call us. I'll give the contact phone number at the end, and just let us know what you think the problem is. You don't have to investigate it yourself. And even if you don't understand the problem completely, we're more than happy to investigate that for you just to see. Sometimes there is a problem, sometimes there's not. It's kind of a complicated area of billing, so sometimes things don't look right sometimes. Sometimes they really aren't right. These are the criminal codes within the state that we would use for investigating a case, and each one of these has lists of elements that have to exist within a case or an investigation in order for our attorney to take it on as a case. Everything, you probably know about ID theft. I don't know if anybody's been a victim of this. It's happening with more frequency with credit card use and online purchases, etc. Sometimes it's as simple as somebody in the nursing home losing control of their checkbook and somebody using those checks or a credit card or getting a credit card in their name. ID theft is just a felony, just flat out a felony. Theft, on the other hand, can be a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the dollar amount of theft. The dollar amount differential between misdemeanor and felony changed in the last few years to $1,500 instead of $1,000. So it has to reach the level of $1,500, which isn't that tough anymore, in order for it to be a felony. And the rest of that is pretty self-explanatory. The last two, I'll explain that for you. It looks like the same thing, but it's a little bit different, and it's a little bit different because of the thought process behind it and the reason it was created. Criminal endangerment would be a felony. That's where you endanger somebody and you knew what was going to happen. You knew that it was wrong. There's a thought process going on in the mind of the suspect that renders it a felony when all of the elements of the crime are looked at. Negligent, however, is a mistake. Maybe a mistake in medication. You give the wrong medication. You didn't really mean to hurt them. That goes misdemeanor. Again, the investigation has to support the elements in each one of these for there actually to be a crime committed. So what can you report to us? We're going to get to timesheets in just a minute, but anything that looks to you like a Medicaid recipient or rest home resident is being abused in some way or exploited. And it happens to a high rate for people who, there's reasons for their victimology. Either they need the help, either their family members don't live near them anymore to keep track. Roofers, pavers, sometimes these people come through and take the deposits and don't do the service, etc. You can report to us anything that looks like a financial exploitation of somebody's assets or fraud committed within the Medicaid program. We haven't worked one of those cases, and I'm really dreading the day when we get that referral. We've tried to build those bridges of communication with our folks at DPHHS. We find them to be doing an awesome work, and it would be pretty heartbreaking someday if somebody committed a crime within the program. I hope that never occurs. It would be ugly, truly, for us to investigate something like that. Or any crime committed by a Medicaid provider. Usually that's in the billing realm, if they're billing inappropriately. And then timesheet fraud. Timesheet fraud, we're finding, is becoming bigger and bigger. We'll talk about that. These are some of the trends we're seeing. I think financial exploitation of our elderly is at an all-time epidemic level. Now, when I say stuff like that, though, you have to keep in mind that we only see the bad stuff going on. So for those people that are doing the right thing as the POA or power of attorney, and I should have put that on the acronyms, power of attorney or POA, there are a lot of people doing the right thing. We only see it when they're doing the wrong thing. So take my cynicism into account when I say stuff like that. We're seeing a lot of drug diversion. I already mentioned that, but it's really huge, huge, huge. And we're seeing it in absolutely every setting. We're seeing it in the nursing homes, the skilled nursing facilities. We're seeing it in assisted living facilities. And the reason for that happening sometimes is that in the assisted living facilities, theoretically residents are supposed to be able to take care of their medications and administer it themselves, and really the people that are there that are staffing as caregivers are really only supposed to be overseeing that. What we're seeing happening in many of these facilities is that a lot of people are sliding a little faster into dementia than their housing can keep up with in terms of really, are they able to live as independently as you would think in an assisted living facility versus what you would expect to see in a skilled nursing facility. So in some cases, we've seen and gone into assisted living facilities where the person really is a long way down that road of forgetfulness, not being able to really do all of the things independently they used to. Sometimes that's a monetary decision. Sometimes the person really is very comfortable where they are and they don't want to go. And if the caregivers can take care of them in that facility, it seems to work well. But that's why we're seeing some of the problems happening is sometimes they're moving beyond that independence that they used to have. Financial exploitation, financial exploitation, financial exploitation. Huge, huge problem. We'll talk about that down the road a little bit. Falsified timesheets. We're seeing a lot of this for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes there's not enough oversight of what's going on in the caregiver setting with those timesheets. Sometimes the person who is the consumer is receiving the care that's been authorized, and as you know, sometimes that care goes up for intense, they need a little bit more, or it goes down a little bit depending on their physical situation or their mental or emotional situation, and yet the authorized time doesn't keep up with that on a daily basis. It's done on periodic reassessment times. So sometimes more care is being documented than is actually being provided, and vice versa. Fraudulent billing by providers. We have quite a few cases right now of upcoding, meaning they provided one service, but they're billing at a higher reimbursable code. Unbundling. That's a little technical, but it would be like, let's say obstetric services where it's supposed to be billed, if the same provider is providing the antepartum, the delivery, and the postpartum care. All of that's supposed to come in as one code, and sometimes they break them up and bill 3 separate codes. Excessive or unnecessary services. That's a little harder to ferret out. I do think it's happening with out-of-state or internet DME companies that are billing folks. We have an open case now of 2 to 3 online or out-of-state DME companies that are billing our elders for the same thing in the same quantities times 3 every month. That would be a case of excessive or unnecessary services. So the products build up, but oftentimes you can't get that stuff stopped. It's very tough to get that subscription or to get that product and that billing stopped. So that's kind of how that happens. So let's jump into timesheet fraud. How do you know this is happening? I would venture a guess that you all have authorized services for the consumer. Is that okay? Which would be the care plan. And sometimes those services that are being checked, if you have a fraudulent situation, you've got somebody who may be checking all those tasks every day as having been provided when they didn't actually do it. Now, the catch-22 on this, I know, is that sometimes the person doesn't need that service every single day, but it's been authorized. And if over a certain period of time those services aren't being utilized, you stand the chance of losing them. So there's kind of a lag time between what's authorized, what's needed, there can be, and getting that tweaked just right. So sometimes those times entered or the task checked just don't agree with what the care plan is. I'm going to go to this sheet here because I want to also, when we're through with the next 2 items, I want to tell you the responses we get from the people that we interview who are suspected of timesheet fraud, what they tell us, and how to refute that, because it makes sense at the time when we're saying, well, why, and all that sort of stuff. So, and their responses are very interesting, and usually they fall into 2 different responses. Or the caregiver just wasn't providing the care in the time indicated. And of course, we already talked about tasks that were checked and not done. We've heard 2 responses when we've said, why did this happen? Why didn't you tell somebody that they didn't need those tasks? Or why didn't you put down the exact time you were there? One of them is, well, I always provide more care than I actually check. Well, if you're investigating timesheet fraud, how do you prove or disprove that? I can't find corroboration many times, not necessarily in situations with children that have guardians or parents on scene, or the case managers are there quite a bit, that they know what's going on. But in the case of the elderly, how do you prove that this person really came in after their shift at the Conoco convenience store and was actually providing the service when it says on the timesheet that they were actually there at 1 o'clock or 1 to 2 p.m. in the afternoon? Very tough to do, especially when you don't have any corroboration. That one usually doesn't fly. There's a saying within the medical community, from nursing to doctors to CNAs, if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. So those timesheets have to be accurate. The other one is, I wasn't there at that time, but I came in later, and that's just the situation I was just talking about. Well, how do you know and how do you corroborate that? If we know that you weren't there at the time that your timesheet says, there's no free pass for it, but you came in at 1 in the morning instead. That was an actual case where she said, well, I was coming in for the 20 minutes after my shift at the Conoco station, and I really did provide the services, but, off we went. That just doesn't fly. What do you do about it, though? Now, this gets into the tricky situation of, well, I don't feel comfortable confronting the caregiver, or I don't feel comfortable confronting the person that's actually filling that thing out. If you don't feel safe to confront, then don't do it. Just don't confront. But there are some things you can do. If you don't want to confront, you could review the care plan again, because maybe there is a misunderstanding about what's supposed to be provided at what time. And if you have a caregiver who is providing multiple services to multiple people, their schedules get a little bit complicated. I know that. I've seen some of those schedules, and they're pretty complicated. They take a computer to track. But you need to review the care plan with that person and just make sure that everybody's on the same page, so to speak, in that communication. The other thing that's a good reminder is, if they checked the task, it should have been done. It shouldn't have been done 2 days later. It shouldn't have been done last weekend. That timesheet has to be an accurate reflection of what those services were that were provided. The other thing that we hear all the time is that, and mainly with some of our elderly, and I know why that happens. They kind of forget, or they aren't keeping track, or they've got other things, or maybe they got a little dementia on board that, I'm having trouble remembering last week, and I know they are. And I don't think I've been diagnosed yet with dementia. I'm sure it's coming. Probably by the end of the week. But I'm just saying, no blank timesheets should ever be signed by either the consumer or the personal representative, the case manager, or anybody. Those blank timesheets, if it's blank, please don't sign it. Because the idea is to keep control over that timesheet and what's being documented. And if you've lost all control over the situation if you're signing blank timesheets. I understand that many times it's for a sake of convenience, but please don't sign them because you don't know what's being put on there afterwards. And actually, many caregivers are trustworthy, very trustworthy and moral, and they're ethical, and they wouldn't do the wrong thing on those timesheets. But in actuality, if you're the one in control and you're the personal rep, you've lost control if you sign anything that's blank. You have no guarantees of what are on there. And the person signing that, we're going to come to you first. If you're the signature on there, we're coming to you first to ask you what happened and what went sideways. And they should be signed only for that specific time period that is indicated on there. Here's what you can do if you think that you've got a falsified timesheet. You can report it to somebody. There's case managers. If you're the case manager, you could send that information on up the line. You can call our hotline. I'll give you that number at the very end. And again, only if you feel comfortable. If you're not feeling comfortable, or you're feeling a little unsafe or a little bit edgy about talking to the person that did that, then don't do it. be safe, do the right thing, and you can report it and have somebody else deal with that problem. Let me talk, I'm sorry, I'm way behind on this. Okay, here we go. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on drug diversion cases. You know what I think already, that it's at epidemic levels. It's not just me saying that. Within DCI, we have only 3 agents who are working drug diversions, narcotics diversions, and they're not, truly, none of us are interested in the aspirin, that kind of stuff. We're interested specifically in what's termed a Schedule II drug, which is the oxys, all the painkillers, the fentanyl patches, etc. What the drug cops are seeing is tons of pills on the street. If you remember back a ways, and I won't even be able to tell you dates, but early part of this decade, everything was about meth. Everything was about the meth labs and what the cops were finding in the woods, and the labs in the cars and the trunks of cars and discarded environmentally dangerous chemicals, etc., etc. That is not what people are looking at now. They're seeing the pills. They're just seeing gazillions of pills, and I don't know how many zeros that is, but they're seeing a lot of pills on the street. And again, it's the Schedule IIs. There's no real sense to steal an aspirin. I mean, who cares? Those things are very cheap. But Medicaid's paying some big dollars for the Schedule IIs, and that's what they're mainly interested in. These guys are so busy that they don't even answer emails, and it's not because they're derelict in their duty. They just don't have time. There's a great guy who was working these cases down in Butte. He's since transferred into the general section for some of the other cases that DCI works. The only time I could even get a hold of him was if I physically drove to Butte and waited until I saw him, because he didn't have time to do anything except look in his in-basket and then start running. So very busy, very busy. We could probably hire 3 to 9 more agents and they'd be overworked. The street value of illicit drugs is kind of like a black market economy, but it operates according to some supply and demand, of course. Right now, what the price generally is and has stayed stable is about $1 per milligram. So if you've got an 80 milligram tab of oxy or hydro or whatever it is, it's probably going to be about that dollar amount, 1-to-1. The strange thing is, a lot of the dope cops aren't seeing, and I include local law enforcement along with our DCI agents, they're not seeing a whole lot, and the federal agents, they're not seeing a whole lot of the fentanyl patches on the street. There's a reason, and some of that has to do with the way it is used when it's diverted. It's right before lunch, so I'm not going to gross you out with that, but many times these patches need to be treated with great care, even if the average amount of time they spend on somebody's skin. Because if you understand the transdermal patches that contain that drug, the patches put on somebody's skin or their arm, or with the elderly, they sometimes, if they've got a little bit of dementia on board, they kind of put it back here on their back where they can't scratch it off or peel it off. Because if you're getting some of this stuff, there's a reason for that prescription. You need that painkiller, but it should be treated with great care. Many times they're left on the skin for about 72 hours before the patch is changed, with some variations, of course, but there's still a whole lot of dope left in that patch when the allegedly used patch is being taken off. There's still a whole lot of active ingredients in that, so you have to be careful with that. How do you know this is happening? If you have somebody who's been prescribed some of these pain medications and you're noticing that they're in a great deal of pain that narcotic doesn't seem to be touching, there could be 2 reasons for that. One is they're building up a tolerance to it and they need a higher dosage. If they're already, like some hospice, unfortunately some hospice patients, if they're already at a dosage that would kill a horse basically, there might be something else going on there, and that may be that drug is being diverted. We know it's happening in the home settings. We know that people who have their medication boxes in their homes, they're losing meds or selling meds, but they're not getting what they need. And how do you know it's happening? In the case of an assisted living, one of my very first cases when I came to this unit was a woman who was in latter stages of MS, multiple sclerosis. And at the beginning of the shift, the CNAs, the certified nursing assistants, were noticing, or the personal care assistants were noticing that this woman seemed to be in a lot of pain. They did the obvious thing and the right thing. They talked to their director of nursing, and they talked to the doctor, and the doc would say, we'll get her a little bit more. It didn't seem to be touching the problem. Well, it wasn't touching the problem because the person documenting at the end of the previous shift that she was getting that medication, she wasn't really getting it. The person was diverting it and taking it for their own use. So you have a person who desperately needed that medication but was crying for the next 8 hours because her prescription, the way it was worded, was not as needed, PRN, as needed. It was only this amount in this amount of time. So she'd be in excruciating pain for the next 8 hours of that shift until the time rolled around that she could get another one per that prescription. So how do you know this is happening? The discomfort of that person, or that the narcotic doesn't seem to be touching the pain. Is it a victimless crime? I think you can kind of tell from, I'm getting a little more active with my gestures. I think you can see that I think that it is not a victimless crime. I don't even know if I've even heard that term in years, but we used to say that certain things were, well, they're victimless crimes. Nobody's really hurt by this. Not in this case. If you've got a prescription for a narcotic painkiller, you need that prescription. So how do you find it? If you're in a home setting and you think that maybe a caregiver has been diverting some of this, hopefully you have records that are documenting what's being given, at what time, with maybe 1 or 2 signatures or initials that medication was given out. Watch the addition and the subtraction on those lists if you have a med log going on there. Note the packaging. Just make sure that the packaging is intact and that nothing's missing, that you got the amount that the pharmacy said they gave you, etc., etc. Sometimes the fentanyl patch could just be in the blankets or in the laundry. That's where sometimes the nursing facilities find this stuff in the laundry. More often than not, they just don't find it at all, which tells us that there's possibly a problem going on with a diversion. So, missing fentanyl patches. I'm sorry, and I'm not keeping up with this. There we go. I keep forgetting. I'm getting wound up over this subject. Sometimes the narcotics could be substituted with aspirin, so it still looks like something's been given when the amount of medication was not being administered appropriately. Okay, we're going to go on to some financial exploitation real quick. Do you want to open it for questions, or at the end, or something like that?
I was thinking at the end, but does anyone have any questions at this point?
Hi, this is Lori in Great Falls. Has the prescription drug program where the pharmacies talk to each other, has that been implemented yet in this state?
Almost.
So they know who's distributing meds?
Almost. They're going slowly with that because of they want to make sure that they're in compliance with HIPAA. So almost. Not everybody's on board yet. Yeah. They can always. Let me talk about HIPAA really quick in terms of our unit. When a provider or a recipient sign on to either provide Medicaid-funded services or receive Medicaid-funded services, there's a little provision in those contracts that say, but if there is an investigation, which would be by us, basically, if there is an investigation that's been started into a particular allegation or a referral, you shall cooperate with that investigation, meaning we can ask for medical records based on a provision letter or a provider request letter or a subpoena, and that person has to supply those records. So in the case of the pharmacies, they can talk to us and tell us what they think is going on if they want. They can certainly talk to the Bureau Chief Administrator at the Medicaid program, but if we ask for those medical records, they have to supply them. The same goes with Medicaid recipients understanding when they sign up or somebody signs up for them for Medicaid. If we need to look at their medical records to document whether services were provided, et cetera, we are entitled to look at those. So HIPAA is kind of a funny little thing here. Sometimes people have the right to look at that stuff without a whole lot of documentation going back and forth. So, does anybody have a question about that? That covers it pretty quickly. And did that answer the question about the pharmacies completely enough? Yeah?
I was just thinking about I think we were like the only state that didn't have this computerized information system about when prescriptions are filled and how many, and I don't remember when that was supposed to start.
I don't have the exact date.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
That date? No, I do, yeah. Some of it may be implementation cost. It is coming, though. It is not completely implemented, and it may have to do with the cost of softwares, et cetera, et cetera. It could be a very good thing in terms of that communication because of what the pharmacists are seeing. And they're very, very, very careful with that HIPAA information. So they don't just talk to each other and say, I think we got a problem. They either call DPHHS but having that full implementation, I don't have a particular date for you, and I need to do that for the next presentation, but it will be very helpful. Not entirely implemented yet, though. Any other questions on that? Okay. Let's go on to the financial crimes real quick. Why does it happen? It's not just about the economy. The financial exploitation is also about a sense of entitlement, a sense that the money's there, I need it. In some cases, there is, it's not so much about, well, this person really doesn't need that money anyway. It's just that the money is there, and the ability to tap into that is fairly unsupervised. We are working a case now of a facility caregiver who got way into the people's finances and didn't have enough oversight and was playing fast and loose with not only their Medicaid waiver payments to the facility, but also private checking accounts and obtaining credit in these people's names. It's pretty big. The case is getting bigger. Sometimes it's a support for addiction or other problems. No one's looking, that unsupervised issue where I got away with it last time. What we're seeing is that in some people's checking accounts, it looked like she was tapping in just to test the waters, so to speak, to see if anybody was watching. And when we think that nobody was watching, it got more and more. So it's racked up some pretty big dollar amounts by now. How do you know if you're caring for an elderly person, if you're a case manager or somebody within your family this is happening to? How do you know? Sometimes the bills aren't being paid on time. Sometimes the power of attorney or POA has been changed recently. We had a woman who, pretty bright woman, she had a job of great responsibility for many, many years as speechwriters for various politicians, both in DC and locally. But as she got into her 80s and late 80s, early 90s, things were starting to slip a little bit, and she found somebody that was willing to come on board and collect her mail, take her on errands, et cetera, et cetera. We think that what happened on the week that her POA and her physician and attorney were changed, and when she was declared incompetent, we think that this quasi-caregiver had been withholding nutrition, some liquids like water, for instance, and some of her medications, because she said later, I just wasn't feeling well that week, and that was the week that this quasi-caregiver took her to have the power of attorney changed to him and also to have her declared incompetent, so he had full entree into her finances. And you can read the rest of those items there on that list. We used to see, I'm not seeing so many of these blank credit card checks coming in the mails anymore. We used to see checks written on people's accounts for that kind of stuff when people intercepted the mail or were collecting the mail for their elderly consumer or client. Sometimes the mail just isn't coming to them anymore. This case that I was just speaking about, a fairly large embezzlement case and theft case, the mail was being diverted. It was coming to the person's address at the facility, but it was being diverted way before the person ever saw it. So past due notices were being racked up. The credit histories are just a shambles for these people. And I can't wait to see what's said in the suspect interview about why and how and what the money was spent for, but the credit histories are just a shambles. Sometimes it's just as simple as properties disappearing. They don't know where it went. We had a case in a town south of here that this was an in-home caregiver house cleaner who would befriend the newly widowed gentleman, perhaps, that had hired this person, and then somehow the late wife's jewelry was starting to disappear, cash was disappearing out of his accounts, etc., etc. So sometimes it's belongings and property are starting to go missing. The other thing is signatures on checks that don't look like the signature of the account holder. This would be for somebody, obviously, that has checking accounts. If you're a POA for somebody or a family member, or you're caring for somebody who has all of their financial stuff set up, you want to keep track of what's going on those financial documents. And unexplained withdrawals and ATM activity debit cards. It used to be, and now I'm going to mention 9/11. What does that have to do with anything? Prior to 9/11, local banks had known these people for many years, and when they saw a problem, they would call local law enforcement, or they would call our office and say, I think something's wrong because of this, this, and this. If you remember back to 9/11, a lot of security measures began being implemented, and that included the banking industry. That information flow shut down after 9/11. Everything is obtainable if you have enough probable cause and an investigative subpoena. But we don't hear from banks like we used to, and friends of mine that work white-collar crime at local law enforcement agencies are no longer able to just pick up the phone for one of their contacts and say, what can you tell me about this? I think I got a problem. Everything has to now be legal documents. That's appropriate. I'm not complaining about that. I'm just saying that the access to this kind of information isn't as easy as it used to be. And of course, credit cards. We see a lot of stuff. If we get these subpoenas to look at bank records or at credit card statements, you can pretty much document the crime as it's happening. Or you can see where something has suddenly started going sideways. Yesterday it was okay, today it's not, and you're starting to see more unexplained charges. So if you have the supervision or care of somebody who has credit cards, or you have access to be able to look at their credit history once in a while, I highly recommend it, because sometimes you're going to see evidence of the crimes there. You're going to see unpaid medical balances. You're going to see credit cards that the person doesn't have, theoretically, although they may have been obtained in their name, ID theft. I think those kinds of documents tell you an awful lot of things. I love financial cases, because once you start looking at those financial documents, your work's already done for you. All you have to do is document and put into spreadsheets what you're seeing. We've talked about that case with the woman's physician and attorney having been changed with her quasi-caregiver, and we've talked about the credit history, so we'll move on. The tools we use to investigate are those provider request letters I made mention of, investigative subpoenas. We'll do interviews with everybody. And if we ever were to interview you, doesn't mean we think you're a suspect, but we have to collect the information somehow. So we would include anybody associated with that particular victim. We would include that in our interview request. Analysis, we have to get records and documents to corroborate some of the allegations and referrals. So once we obtain those, we have a couple of auditors in the office. Sometimes I help them if they're overworked, but there would be an in-depth analysis done of any documents we could get. And of course the Medicaid billing and reimbursement. What happens to these cases? They can just flat out be closed as unfounded. If you were to call in and make a referral, it doesn't mean that the thing goes all the way to court and is in the press. And we have many people who call in and say, look, I just want to be anonymous. If you do that to local law enforcement, that's where the referral is going to stop. It doesn't have to happen with us that way. There is a point at which you can't be anonymous anymore if it becomes a case that the attorney takes on and files charges in court. Because once charges are filed in a court, everything opens up and becomes public information. We've taken quite a few of our referrals and said, we can't reach the level that we need to present this to an attorney or for our attorney to take it and file charges, so we may give it back to the SIRS unit for consideration of overpayment. It can be reviewed by a prosecutor and prosecuted. It can be pursued civilly in addition to a criminal prosecution. Sometimes civilly is a nice way to go because that would mean that it was a false claim, and you can collect up to 3 times what that face value of that claim was, and $11,000 per submission. That's a big amount if you've got a provider that's been pinging the system with false claims. That's a huge amount of money. We do have a case right now that we think is going to go that way. It's going to be a significant amount of change. Significant. Sometimes that's even better, because if you've got somebody who's billing Medicaid inappropriately, if you hurt them in the pocketbook, that's really a nice solution to some of these problems. And the reason I say that is because many times the fraud was committed because of money issues anyway. So, and what can happen on a criminal conviction? The suspect or the defendant by then can be excluded completely from any federally funded health plan. That's just about everything. That means you probably need to go and get retrained for another job, and that can happen 5 to 10 years, sometimes permanently. And then, of course, DPHHS would be looking at the licensing and the provider status to see if they really want that person continuing within the program. Okay, I want to talk about this just really quickly about the failure to prove criminal intent, or when cases fail in prosecution or charges being filed, and why does that happen? It's a frustrating thing, especially if you've put hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours into an investigation, or you as the complainant or the person making the referral know that something happened, and why can't those cops just get it together and get this case finished? Because in the criminal realm, you have to meet that level of criminal intent. It's a test for the jury or the judge. Intent beyond just a reasonable doubt. The reason why civil cases sometimes are a little easier is because it's the preponderance of the evidence, not beyond a reasonable doubt. And when you see false billing, sometimes it's easier to get to a preponderance of the evidence, the pattern of the billing. With criminal intent, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt for a reasonable person, which would be you folks. Sometimes the witnesses or the documents just don't support the facts of the case or what the person calling had alleged in their call. Sometimes we just can't get there from there, can't get there from here. And sometimes we get into he said, she said situations. You see a lot with sexual assault cases. There's no witnesses to some of this stuff, so you only have 2 people saying one thing and the other person saying the other. It happens a lot in traffic cases. It would be a really hard job to be a judge or to be a jury, and then for an attorney to try to defend or prosecute that kind of a thing. Or after the investigation gets rolling, we involve our prosecutor from the very beginning that we accept a referral and say, this is what we got. We don't ask him what we need to do because we know what our job is and what we're supposed to do. And that starts making him a witness. But we do say, this is what we're looking at. And at different landmarks within the investigation, we involve him and say, this is what we've found so far, so that he's on board and he can always say, you know what? You're not getting anywhere. You're wasting your time and you're just not going to get to where you need to be. So then we have to step back and say, is there anything we could do better? More work? More documents? What do we need? And sometimes we just can't get there from here. So sometimes there's no witnesses. I just said that on some of the sexual assault cases. Sometimes there just flat aren't any witnesses to help you corroborate what really happened, and you don't have any physical evidence. It's very hard. So you can't substantiate those particular allegations. It doesn't mean that the caller calling the problem in was lying or making stuff up or got it wrong somehow. Sometimes we just can't get the necessary evidence we need to go forward. It's a heartbreaker. One case we had almost 3,000 hours of investigative time in with a couple of different agencies, an unbelievable amount of documents, and we just couldn't get there. Couldn't we have found that a little bit earlier? You would have thought. But the whole investigation was looking really good until the very final point when attorneys were beginning to look at the documentation and look at what we had, and they just said, I'm sorry. kind of a heartbreaker, but the work was done and it was good work. These are our contact numbers, and then I'll open it up for questions if you have it. The hotline, free call to you if you have an allegation or you think something's going wrong. That 800 number is answered Monday through Friday. We have an awesome person answering that phone. She's just great. I'm not going to tell you her name because I don't want her recruited by anybody. But she's awesome. And she's absolutely one of the nicest people you could ever speak with. This is my direct line, the second phone number there, the 4606 number. You're welcome to call that. I do answer my voicemail. We have a fax number that is secure and goes directly into our office. And then we'll take whatever information comes in on these phone calls or mail. We'll put it on a referral form for sure. And then we'll start to look and see if we have the jurisdiction or the nexus to work that case. If we don't, what I promise you is that instead of you having to go through the state directory and spend 8 hours on the phone trying to find the right person, I'll find that person for you. If we can't work it, we'll get that information to them. That's my promise to you. Shall we open it to questions if there are any?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I have one. If we're suspecting some financial fraud, my first inclination would have been to call APS.
Mhm.
Do they then call you, or
They can.
would you call? Yeah. Who should get those first? Who gets the call first?
Anybody you can find to call first. APS is a great place to start. Those folks are fabulous. We've received many of their reports in the past. Sometimes we don't have the jurisdiction to work the case, and so they will take it to local law enforcement. Now, this is a discussion that we're having at DCI is can we put in a different type of investigative function within DCI that would handle those cases? Because if you talk to APS, they've had mixed results with local law enforcement working these cases for a lot of different reasons. It doesn't mean that there's not great cops and great deputies out there working those cases. Working financial fraud is a lot different than working patrol, though. And if there's anybody in the crowd, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, who just, when has it last been that you balanced your checkbook and enjoyed that process, you'll understand where we're going with this, because a financial fraud investigation is data-rich, hundreds and thousands of pieces of paper from anywhere you can get them, usually at the financial institutions, and then you've got to analyze it. The average cop on the street does not have time to do that, and many times, because of the nature of crime, unfortunately, there's a prioritization within the detective bureaus, if they have a detective bureau. And when I talk to the kids at the academy and I ask them, how many of you will be giving your cases or your reports to the detective bureau, there's some places that just don't have that luxury. They have to work it all themselves. So I can probably give you a handful of people that are just awesome at this kind of work, but they are scattered across the state. And sometimes APS has not had trouble with law enforcement. They've had trouble at the prosecution level at the county attorney's office in terms of getting anybody to take the case. If it's a power of attorney problem, county attorneys in many counties will not even take those cases. They'll say, if there's a power of attorney, they had the legal right to do whatever they wanted with those funds. Well, not exactly. It's a civil crime. The crime of theft by POA is actually found in the civil statute. So it's a civil crime according to county attorney's office. It's still theft, I know. But in the civil statute says if you've got POA, you will never take that money for yourself. That will always be for the client or the consumer or the family member for whom you hold that POA. But unfortunately, many times it's not handled within a county attorney's office because they're not theoretically set up to do civil prosecutions. APS has just sometimes pulled their hair out over some of this stuff, and they've had some really awesome cases. We could talk for hours about some of these cases that just couldn't go anywhere because either there was a POA, and if there's a joint checking account, the smartest thing a thief could do would be to get on a joint checking account, because banking regulations say if you've got a joint checking account, everybody owns the money, assets in that account 100%, no questions asked. Smartest thing a thief could do. So who do you call?
Yeah.
You can call us, you can call APS, you can call local law enforcement. There are a lot of options out there, and if you ever have any questions about that, my direct line is there, and we could kind of brainstorm that if you've got a particular problem. We do have somebody, an auditor in DCI that works those kinds of financial fraud cases. She's mainly gotten assigned to the narcotics financial finagling that goes on with some of these drug consortiums, if I can call them that, because if you're talking drugs, you're talking money, and many times following the money is really a better way to work the case than just to follow where the pills went, because it's big money. So she's overworked too, but we could talk about that if you've got a particular question about that.
Okay.
Local law enforcement's a great place to start, so is APS. And the other thing is that I would say about who do you call? If you call APS, they can oftentimes get the hemorrhaging of the cash stopped by either putting in temporary guardianships if they want to do that, if they can do that, if they have the right to do that. Sometimes they can apply other solutions to the problem than just simply, we got a criminal here, who's going to work that case? There's a lot of different solutions to different problems.
I guess what I was wondering was, because I've called APS enough times to know locally here the workers there, and they're terrific, given
They're
what
awesome.
they can do,
Yeah.
what they're able to do. But I didn't know if there was an automatic, then, heads up to you folks, if there were something financial involved, or if there were Medicaid fraud suspected, if they just automatically call
No.
you, or...
They used to, and the problem is, the feds have gotten real sticky about what our jurisdiction is. If it's a family member exploitation outside of a Medicaid-funded facility, like skilled nursing, assisted, they say we don't have the jurisdiction to work it. Our state law says we do. The federal law says, hands off. That's not what we're paying you people to do. They pay 3/4 of our budget, so we have to listen. That's part of the discussion at DCI right now is, can we find the funding to support at least 1 or 2 investigators plus a financial analyst to work with those officers or agents because there's a hole in the system there. And if you can't get local law enforcement to do it, what do you do if you've got a criminal case? So that discussion is happening because it's epidemic.
It's good, it's frustrating.
It's very frustrating. Oh, yeah. Oh, now we're going to talk frustration.
Oh, frustration.
Oh, no, we're going to be here till 5.
We're going to be here until next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Okay, Great Falls has a question.
Go ahead. I hope I do
have
better
a
on
question
this one.
about,
I hope I do better on the answer on this one for you.
You will.
Okay.
You're great. My question is about, you said if it's a joint bank account, assets are owned equally. What if a person has their own individual account, but they have given authorization to somebody else just to sign on that account? Is that seen in the same way?
No. No, it's not. And in that case, I would recommend a referral either to local law enforcement, APS, or to our office so that we can get that to somebody to look at. Because if that's what's going on, there's probably a lot of other things going on, possibly ID theft, etc. But no, it is not looked at the same way. And there is, even if it's a POA, those things can be revoked as long as the person with the account has the capacity. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the TV screen rather than the camera, but so you're always looking at the whites of my eyes. That if the person's got the capacity to revoke that, that's awesome. If they don't have the capacity, it makes it a little stickier. That's when I would recommend the APS involvement and some other maybe some communication or some brainstorming about how are we going to get this one solved. Sometimes it's a temporary guardianship need. Sometimes it's a personal rep change, personal representative change. We never even talked about Social Security, personal rep stuff. That's, anyway. But some of these are a little sticky in terms of how do you get the problem solved. And what I'm coming to believe and have believed now for a while is that there isn't just one answer. Sometimes it takes many agencies getting their brains working and talking to each other around a table like that in Great Falls and say, here's the problem, who's got jurisdiction, and how do we get from here to there? So it sounds like a complicated answer, but I think there's more than one solution. And the most important thing, the mission, is to save that person's assets and to make sure there's no further exploitation. So, and that's a long answer to a simple question. No, it's not the same as a joint account, which is a good thing. Yes, ma'am.
Janice.
This is Missoula. How far back do you go for investigations? We had a case last year where we had an individual who was exploited by one of our staff persons, and we estimated probably at least 2,500, maybe even more than that. We turned it into the police department here in Missoula, and at the time they were overwhelmed with all these other things going on, and so I worked very diligently with the detective, but I don't think anything ever really came of that. And so, how far back and once we referred it to the police department, can we still call you and say, we would really like for you to look into this, because this person's never gotten any money back from the money that was stolen, and credit cards were purchased, and loans were taken out for this client, and it was really, checks were signed by the staff person, but we never really saw a resolution through the local law enforcement.
And was the person in their own home? Were they in a group home? Were they in a facility?
They were in their own apartment where we provide the care.
Okay, I got it.
And
there's a couple of answers. There were a couple of questions in that, and let me answer the statute of limitations first. For felonies, you can go back 5 years. For misdemeanors, $1,500 or less, you've got a year to get that case worked. I no longer work within a sex crimes unit, so I'm not going to deal with that, or a homicide unit. I never worked that, but there are some particularities to those crimes that start the statute running, or the statute of limitations running a little differently depending on when it was reported. So I'm not going to get into that. So that's your statute of limitations. 1 year for misdemeanors, less than $1,500. 5 years for felonies, anything over $2,500. The other thing to now, the other issue was, where does the person live? In past years, I would have taken the case in a heartbeat. Because the feds are really cracking down on the fraud unit's jurisdictional issues, and I'm not even going to get into the frustration level of the answer to that question, because, again, we'll be here till 5 at least. We probably couldn't take it, which is unfortunate, which is why we're having the discussion internally about there's a big hole in this system. If local law enforcement can't due to caseload, if they can't they can't work the case due to other issues, who else is going to be able to do this? Because a theft has occurred. You've got ID theft, I'm hearing ID theft, cash theft, checks being forged, etc., etc. Who's going to work those? The other thing you can do is, again, it goes back to one of my last slides about if we can't work it, my promise is let's find somebody who can. I would start shopping that case to a couple of different places. I would take it upstairs to my supervisor and say, here's what we've got, this is the referral, here's the dollar amount, is anybody available to work that? Now the problem you run in with that is because our general agents are also working homicides, they're working missing persons cases sometimes, so you have to fit in with their caseload too, which is what you have to do at the county level and the local law enforcement city level too. So that's kind of a shotgun approach answer for that. I might be tempted, meaning you, to get on the phone with the detective and say, what happened here? Is there a reason why the case hasn't been resolved? And Fosket told me to call you. Oh, that would be good. But you're welcome to do that if you want. But can you tell me something about where is this case? Because we still have somebody whose money is missing. Now, they may have gotten all gummed up with a problem that occurs out there, and that is, did the person implicitly give permission for that money to be used? I think sometimes you can make a case that is not what happened here. But in the past, I know that we've gotten gummed up with that issue of, did they really give permission or did they not? We had a really good case like that in a town south of here where she was taking him gambling. She was using the caregiver, his resources inappropriately in that way, and lost a lot of money for him. But he had not been declared incompetent, and he went with her. So sometimes, as in law enforcement, you get gummed up with some of those stupid issues. emphasis on the stupid issues, because we really know what happened there. There was theft. So that may be what you're faced with, or it wouldn't hurt giving the detective or the officer a call, or even the supervising officer for that, whoever is overseeing that casework. Does that help? Not really, because this person's still out the money. Yeah.
Are there any other questions for Deb? Comments? Okay.
And I will get the date to you, Kathy, on either when that pharmacy program was implemented or what the expectation is of full implementation.
Okay.
My understanding was it's not done yet.
Okay.
And again, I could be wrong, but I will get that information.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I just have one question.
Okay.
Misdemeanors were less than 1,500, and then you said that felonies were greater than 2,500. What happens between 1,500
I'm sorry.
and 2,500?
I misspoke. The felonies are above 1,500. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the
Okay.
$1,500 is the dividing
Okay.
line. Yeah, if I said some other number, Fosket's out of her mind. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, Deb, thank you very much. You're always a great help.
Well, fill out those evals any way you want. It does help. It caused a complete rewrite from the last time we did this, so if there's something that's not helpful, tell us so we can get rid of it. And if there's something you'd rather hear, please, they're very helpful, so those evals make a big difference.
Okay. And I will be sending out the evals to everyone who attends, so thank you. All right, well, it is now noon, and our next session is scheduled for 1 o'clock with Acumen, so enjoy your lunch. Thank you.